The dust of Redemption, Arizona tasted of grit and broken promises. It settled in a fine red film on the instruments Gideon Nash polished with a cloth, the brass and glass gleaming under the oppressive weight of the afternoon sun. At 28, Gideon was a man of meticulous habits and quiet ambition, a surveyor whose world was measured in angles, elevations, and the unwavering certainty of magnetic north. His slight frame and scholarly spectacles had earned him a lifetime of underestimation, a fact he had learned to leverage into a kind of invisibility, allowing him to observe the world with an unreciprocated intensity. He sat at a small, outdoor table at the town's only respectable eatery, a plate of congealed beans forgotten beside him. His focus was on the final preparations for his expedition into the territory. The Western Pacific Railroad Company was paying him handsomely to chart the most efficient path for their iron snake, a task he approached with the dispassionate precision of a surgeon. Yet beneath the professional veneer, he carried a private ache, a hollow space carved out by the ghosts of his parents. His father, a Pennsylvania coal miner swallowed by black lung. His mother, a school teacher who gifted him a love of maps before influenza stole her away. They had taught him that a man's worth was measured by the sharpness of his mind, not the breadth of his shoulders, a comforting philosophy that often felt thin against the harsh realities of the frontier. A familiar voice broke his concentration. Still fussing with those contraptions, Gideon looked up, a genuine smile touching his lips. Sheriff Elias Thorne stood before him, a bulwark of a man, whose weathered face was a map of its own, etched with the sun and sorrows of 60 years. His badge, a tarnished silver star, was pinned to a vest stretched taut across his broad chest. Elias had been his father's closest friend back in the mining camps, two men who had shared the darkness of the earth before Elias sought the blinding light of the West. "A craftsman is only as good as his tools," Elias Gideon replied, setting aside a polished sextant. "And your father was the best craftsman I ever knew." Elias said, his voice rumbling with fond memory. He settled into the chair opposite Gideon, the wood groaning in protest. He could timber a collapsing shaft with nothing but a hand axe and a prayer. Said you had his hands just for a different kind of work. The mention of his father was a familiar bittersweet pang. He'd be baffled by this, all numbers and lines. He preferred the solid feel of wood and stone. He'd be proud, Elias corrected gently. Proud you found a way to build things on the surface instead of getting buried beneath it. He nodded toward the sheriff's office across the street. Your father's compass is ready, by the way. Old man Hemlock worked his magic. Polished the silver casing right up. It's sitting on my desk. Relief washed over Gideon. The compass was more than an instrument. It was his only heirloom, a gift from his father on his 14th birthday, just months before the coal dust finally claimed him. It was a beautiful, weighty thing, its silver casing intricately engraved with a miner's knot, a symbol of unbreakable bonds. Thank you, Elias. I'll pick it up before I head out tomorrow. You see you do. A man needs a reliable compass out there. The world has a way of spinning you around otherwise. Elias's gaze drifted down the dusty street, his eyes narrowing slightly. Speaking of which, troubles blowing in on the east wind. Gideon followed his gaze. 4 riders had entered town, their horses moving with a weary deliberation that failed to mask the tension in their posture. They were hard men draped in filthy dusters, their faces obscured by low-brimmed hats and trail dust. They didn't look like cowboys or prospectors. They looked like wolves circling a pen. Sorensen gang Elias murmured, his hand instinctively dropping to rest on the butt of his Colt, thought they were hitting targets further north. The riders dismounted in front of the Redemption Bank and trust their movements economical and unnervingly synchronized. The tallest of them, a man who moved with a chilling predatory grace, pushed open the bank's doors and disappeared inside his companions, taking up positions on the boardwalk. The afternoon quiet shattered. A woman's scream, sharp and terrified, sliced through the air, followed by the deep boom of a shotgun blast from within the bank. People on the street froze, then scattered, diving for cover in doorways and alleyways. Elias was already on his feet, his revolver in his hand. "Stay down, Gideon," he commanded, his voice devoid of its earlier warmth, now cold and hard as iron. Gideon ducked behind his table, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the frontier's brutal arithmetic. A peaceful afternoon could become a slaughter in the space of a heartbeat. He watched as Elias moved with the steady, deliberate pace of a man who had faced death many times before. He didn't rush. He used the cover of a water trough and a parked wagon, closing the distance to the bank. "This is Sheriff Thorne." Elias's voice boomed across the now silent street. "Come out with your hands empty. You have my word you won't be harmed." The bank door creaked open. The leader of the gang stepped out, a heavy canvas bag in one hand and a smoking Schofield revolver in the other. He was a striking man, not for any handsomeness, but for the stark intelligence that burned in his cold gray eyes. A thin, pale scar cut a diagonal line from his left eyebrow to his jaw, giving his face a permanently cruel cast. He was articulate, his voice carrying with an educated, mocking cadence that was far more terrifying than a simple brute snarl. "Your word, Sheriff," the man called back, a wry smile playing on his lips. "Forgive me, but the word of a small-town lawman carries about as much weight as the dust on my boots. We'll be taking our leave now. Not with the bank's money, you won't." Elias stated, his own pistol leveled and steady. "And not after you've discharged a weapon in my town." The leader, Silas Kane, let out a soft chuckle. "Your town a quaint notion. Men like you are merely caretakers holding the land until men of vision and will like myself arrive to claim it." He took a step forward, utterly fearless. "Now stand aside, old man. I have no desire to add the death of a public servant to today's ledger, but I am a businessman above all else. And you are a debit I am prepared to cancel." Elias stood his ground. "You're not leaving redemption with that money, Kane." Kane's smile vanished, replaced by an expression of bored impatience. "So be it." It happened with sickening speed. Kane didn't raise his gun. Instead, one of his men positioned on the roof of the adjacent mercantile fired a rifle. The shot echoed, and Sheriff Elias Thorne crumpled to the ground, a dark stain blossoming on the front of his vest. A collective gasp rose from the hidden townspeople. Gideon felt the world tilt, the sun-bleached street dissolving into a blur of meaningless shapes. He saw Kane's men emerge from the bank, mounting their horses with unhurried efficiency. Kane himself, however, did not immediately follow. He strode across the street to the sheriff's office, kicked open the door, and disappeared inside. A moment later, he emerged, wiping his hands on a cloth. In his grasp was a small silver object that glinted in the sun, Gideon's father's compass. Kane glanced down at the fallen sheriff, then his cold eyes swept the street, passing over Gideon's hiding place without a flicker of recognition. He mounted his horse, a picture of calm, deadly authority. "Redemption," he said to the terrified, silent town. "An ironic name for a place with nothing worth saving." With that, he and his gang spurred their horses and galloped out of town, leaving behind a dead sheriff, a looted bank, and a silence thick with shock and grief. Gideon was the first to reach Elias. He knelt in the dust, the metallic scent of blood sharp in his nostrils. The old sheriff's eyes were open, staring sightlessly at the indifferent blue sky. The bullet had taken him high in the chest. He had likely died instantly. Gideon's hand trembled as he reached out and gently closed his friend's eyes. A wave of cold fury, unlike anything he had ever known, washed through him. It wasn't just the murder of a good man, a man who had been a living link to his own past. It was the casual, contemptuous theft of the compass. Kane hadn't known its significance, couldn't have. To him, it was just a pretty trinket, a bauble to be pocketed after committing murder. But to Gideon, it was everything. It was the last tangible piece of his father, a symbol of a bond that death could not break. And this man, this articulate monster, had stolen it as an afterthought. The townsfolk were gathering now, their faces masks of horror and disbelief. Someone was helping the wounded bank teller. Someone else was covering Elias's body with a blanket. But Gideon saw none of it. He saw only the dust cloud on the horizon where Cain's gang had disappeared. His railroad survey was no longer just a job. It was a vector, a line on a map that would lead him into the same vast, lawless territory where Cain had fled. His professional mission had just been violently subsumed by a personal one. He would complete his survey for the Western Pacific, yes, but along the way, he would hunt. He would find Silas Cain. He would recover his father's compass. And he would see justice done for the last friend his father had left him. In the heart of the precise, methodical surveyor, a new unsparing compass had just been set and its needle pointed unwaveringly toward revenge. 3 days later, the world had been scoured down to rock sky and the relentless jolting of a horse. Gideon rode at the rear of the Western Pacific Survey Party, a small caravan of wagons and riders pushing into the sun-bleached mesas that shimmered under a white-hot sky. The railroad company had promised protection, but the guards they had provided were a lethargic, disinterested lot, more concerned with their whiskey flasks than the surrounding territory. Gideon's grief had cooled into a hard, dense core in his chest. He scanned the horizon not just for survey landmarks, but for any sign of Cain's gang. Every distant rider, every dust devil sparked a surge of adrenaline. He was a hunter now, and the landscape was no longer a series of topographical features to be mapped, but a hunting ground to be read. The attack came without warning. No mercy, just a sudden thunder of hooves and gunfire ripping through the morning quiet. Men in filthy dusters with bandanas obscuring their faces descended upon the travelers like a plague of locusts. It was Cain's gang. Gideon recognized the cruel efficiency, the same dispassionate butchery he had witnessed in Redemption. A wagon erupted in flames. The railroad guards, so confident moments before, were cut down in the first volley. "Run," someone shrieked. Every man for himself. Gideon's horse, a placid beast chosen for steadiness, reared in sheer terror as a bullet whizzed past his ear. He clung to the reins, his slight frame no match for the animal's panic. The horse bucked again, a violent convulsive shudder, and Gideon was thrown. He felt himself airborne for one sickening moment before crashing down the rocky slope of a ravine. Pain exploded through his ribs as he tumbled the world a spinning kaleidoscope of azure sky and rust-red earth. When he finally stopped rolling, he lay still, the metallic taste of blood filling his mouth. Above him, the gunfire and screams faded as the raiders moved on. His satchel containing the precious survey maps had somehow stayed with him, its strap cutting into his shoulder. He struggled to his feet, a wave of dizziness washing over him. He needed cover. But as he turned to seek shelter deeper in the ravine, 3 horsemen appeared at the rim above, silhouetted against the unforgiving sun. They were not from Cain's main party. They were stragglers, scavengers picking over the remains. "Well, looky what we found," the largest one called out, his voice a gravelly sneer. A little runt who took a tumble. They guided their horses down the slope with practiced ease, surrounding Gideon. The leader dismounted, a hulking brute who towered over him. "What you got in that fancy bag, boy?" He prodded Gideon's chest with the barrel of his revolver. "Something worth dying for." "Just papers," Gideon replied, his voice raspy. "Survey reports, nothing of value." A stream of tobacco juice landed inches from Gideon's boot. "Sounds like railroad business. You one of them map makers?" Gideon's silence earned him a swift backhand across the face. The blow sent him stumbling, his split lip filling his mouth with fresh blood. "He asked you a question, little man?" Another of the outlaws sneered. Gideon had seen this brand of cruelty before. It wasn't enough to rob a man. They had to break him first, piece by piece. "I don't want any trouble," he managed to say. The leader grinned, revealing a ruin of tobacco-stained teeth. "Oh, we'll take what we want." He cocked his revolver, the sound impossibly loud in the enclosed space. "But leaving you be?" That ain't part of the plan. He pressed the cold barrel against Gideon's forehead. On your knees. Gideon closed his eyes, his thoughts turning not to his parents, but to Elias Thorne, to the cold finality of his death. He had vowed to find justice, and now he was to die in a forgotten ravine at the hands of common thugs. The irony was a bitter pill. Then a sound, something between a whistle and a grunt, cut through the air. The pressure of the gun barrel vanished from his forehead. Gideon's eyes snapped open. The three outlaws were looking around, guns drawn, a sudden animal alertness on their brutish faces. It happened so fast, he would later struggle to reassemble the sequence. A blur of movement from the top of the ravine, something large descending with the impossible silence of a hawk, and then the leader was on the ground, his face a mask of shock as his wrist bent at an unnatural angle, his revolver clattering against the rocks. Standing over him was the tallest woman Gideon had ever seen. She was Apache. That much was clear from the cut of her buckskin dress and the intricate beadwork that adorned it. But it was her stature that was so arresting. She stood well over 6 feet with broad shoulders and powerful arms that rippled with muscle as she moved. Her black hair, braided with eagle feathers and what looked like small polished bones, fell past her waist. Her face was a sculpture of elegant, severe planes, and her dark eyes burned with a fierce, formidable intelligence. The two remaining outlaws, recovering from their shock, raised their weapons. The woman moved like liquid lightning. Her fist connected with the second man's jaw with a sickening crack that echoed in the ravine. Her knee drove upward into the third man's groin, doubling him over. When he tried to crawl away, she caught him by the collar and threw him face first into the dirt with contemptuous ease. Within moments, all 3 men were on the ground, moaning or unconscious. The woman stood over them, her chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, not a single strand of her long hair out of place. She was a vision of primal disciplined power, an ancient goddess of war descended to this dusty, violent earth. Gideon stared up at his savior, his heart hammering against his injured ribs. "Are you hurt?" she asked. Her voice was deeper than most men's, yet undeniably feminine. And her English was fluent, marked only by a formal, precise cadence. He shook his head, still unable to find his own voice. She extended a hand to help him up. Her palm was calloused, but her touch was surprisingly gentle. Standing beside her, Gideon felt like a child. She was everything he was not: tall, powerful, radiating an aura of dangerous confidence. Why, he finally managed to croak. "Why help me?" Her dark eyes studied his face with an intensity that felt as if she were surveying the landscape of his soul. Then she pointed at his satchel, which had fallen open, revealing the maps inside. "You are the map maker," she said, her tone a statement of fact, not a question. "My people have need of your skills. The Iron Road comes and it will devour our lands unless we can define them in a language your leaders will understand." The language of lines on paper. Before Gideon could process this, she stiffened her head, turning sharply toward the eastern end of the ravine. He heard it a moment later, the rhythmic pounding of hooves and the jingle of sabers. The cadence was too orderly, too disciplined for outlaws. "Cavalry," Gideon said, relief washing over him. "They'll help us." The woman's expression transformed into something hard and dangerous. In one fluid motion, she grabbed Gideon's arm and pulled him toward a narrow crevice in the ravine wall. "Hide," she commanded, her voice urgent. "Those men are more dangerous than these. The soldiers, but they're—" Her grip tightened, a warning of her immense strength. "Quiet," she hissed, "or we both die." She pulled him into the fissure, the space so tight their bodies were pressed together. He could feel the warmth radiating from her smell, the clean scents of sage and leather that clung to her. Her dark eyes, inches from his, held a wisdom born of bitter experience. "Not all men who wear blue coats have righteous hearts," she said, her voice a low murmur against his ear. "Their leader, Captain Reynolds, hunts my people like animals. He especially hunts me." 5 cavalry soldiers rode into view, their uniforms caked with dust. At their head rode a tall, weathered man with a thick mustache and captain's bars on his shoulders. He dismounted, surveying the unconscious outlaws with a cold, clinical detachment. "Captain Wallace Reynolds," the woman whispered. "His brother assaulted women of my tribe. I delivered justice where the white man's law would not." Gideon's eyes widened. "You killed his brother?" Her gaze was unflinching. "He earned his death." Outside, Reynolds nudged one of the outlaws with his boot. Spread out, he ordered his men. "Check for tracks. She was here." "How can you be sure, Captain?" a young trooper asked. Reynolds pointed to the outlaw leader's grotesquely broken wrist. "Because these men did not do this to each other. That is Ayanna's work. Find her." His gaze swept the ravine walls, lingering for a terrifying moment on the crevice where they hid. "She is close. I can feel it." In their hiding place, Ayanna's body was coiled like a spring, ready to erupt into violence. Gideon knew she would fight to the death if they were found. A desperate idea born of calculation and an instinct for performance seized him. He squeezed her hand. "Trust me," he whispered. Before she could react, he slipped out of the crevice, his hands raised high. "Don't shoot," he called out, his voice shaking with feigned terror. "I'm unarmed." The soldiers spun toward him, rifles raised. Captain Reynolds' eyes narrowed, taking in Gideon's small frame and torn clothing. "Thank God you've come." Gideon babbled, playing the part of a terrified victim. "Our wagon train was attacked. Those men, they were going to kill me when this giant Apache woman appeared out of nowhere. She was like a demon. She beat them senseless." Reynolds' face hardened. "Where did she go?" North, Gideon lied, pointing toward a distant pass. "Headed for the high country, moved faster than any horse." "She looked wounded, sir. Her left shoulder was bleeding." The captain studied him for a long, calculating moment. Gideon held his breath. "Mount up," Reynolds finally commanded his men. "If we ride hard, we can catch her before she reaches Apache territory." He turned back to Gideon. "You'd best get back to what's left of your caravan. This is no place for a civilian." "What's your name, son?" "Gideon Nash, sir. I'm a surveyor for the railroad." Something flickered in the captain's eyes. "A surveyor? Working on the new Western line, I presume?" "Yes, sir." Reynolds nodded slowly, a strange knowing look on his face. "Well, Mr. Nash, I suggest you be more careful about where you draw your lines. Some territories aren't meant to be crossed." With that cryptic warning, he and his men rode off their dust cloud, marking their pursuit of a phantom. Only when the sound of hooves had completely faded did Ayanna emerge. She moved toward Gideon with a predatory grace, her dark eyes unreadable. He wondered if he had overstepped, if she would be angry at his interference. She stood before him so close, he could feel her breath on his face. Why, she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. "Why did you help me?" "You saved my life," Gideon said simply. "I was returning the favor." Her eyes searched his, looking for deceit. Finally, a flicker of something respect, perhaps, softened her gaze. A small man with a clever tongue. A dangerous combination. "I'm Gideon," he said, extending his hand. She looked at it for a moment before taking it in her larger one. Her grip was firm, resolute. "I am Ayanna. You said you need me," Gideon reminded her. "To map your lands." Her expression grew serious again. "Yes. The chiefs have tried to speak with your government men, but their words are wind. We need paper with white man's marks. We need proof of what has been ours since the beginning of time." She paused, her gaze intense. "This is a dangerous path I ask you to walk. Those who help my people are seen as traitors by your own." The noon supply train's whistle echoed from the valley below, a mournful cry from the world he was supposed to be a part of. His supervisors would be on that train, expecting a progress report. By now he was a deserter, a potential collaborator. "Choose now, Gideon Nash." Ayanna said, her voice low and urgent. "Will you draw lines for the men of the Iron Road? Or will you draw them for the cause of truth?" Gideon looked down at his satchel at the maps that would help dispossess her people. He thought of Elias Thorne, murdered by a man who believed he was above the law. He thought of Silas Cain, a man of vision and will who took whatever he wanted. He thought of his stolen compass, a symbol of a legacy Cain sought to erase. Perhaps there was more than one kind of justice to be found in this wilderness. He met Ayanna's gaze, the choice suddenly irrevocably clear. His path to Cain and his path to a purpose greater than himself had just converged. "Truth," he said, his voice steady. "Show me what I need to see." Relief flickered across Ayanna's face, quickly replaced by a fierce determination. "Come," she said, gathering his satchel. "It is not safe here. Our journey begins now." As they slipped away from the ravine, heading west into the rugged, sun-scorched heart of Apache territory, Gideon knew he had just crossed a boundary from which there was no return. His world, once defined by the clear, predictable lines of a surveyor's map, had just exploded into a landscape of moral ambiguity, ancient loyalties, and a personal quest for vengeance that would lead him into the very soul of the land he had only intended to measure. As dusk painted the canyons in shades of violet, and Rose Ayanna led Gideon to a hidden sanctuary, a shallow cave carved into a sandstone cliff, its entrance veiled by a curtain of desert willow. Inside, a small smokeless fire cast dancing shadows on walls adorned with faded pictographs, ancient stories of hunts and spirits. "You have been planning this," Gideon observed, noting the neat cache of supplies, bedrolls, dried provisions, and a sturdy wooden chest. For many seasons, Ayanna confirmed her formal English, a stark contrast to the primal setting. She moved with an economy of motion, preparing a simple meal of corn cakes and dried meat. I watched the other map makers. They saw only rock and great obstacles to their iron road. I watched you. You see the land as it is. You document the streams, the ancient trails, the places where the spirits dwell. You see the truth of it. The idea that this formidable woman had been observing him for weeks was both unsettling and strangely validating. You waited for the right person. The right tool, she corrected, though not unkindly. My people have words and traditions. Your world has laws and documents. To protect our home, we must learn to fight with your weapons. Paper is a sharper blade than any knife. She unlocked the wooden chest, revealing not weapons, but books and scrolls, the legacy of a man she called Father Thomas, a priest who had lived among her people. He had taught her to read and write, to understand the white man's laws and his treaties. She handed Gideon a yellowed document dated 1853, a treaty promising the Apache dominion over these lands forever. Its geographical descriptions, however, were hopelessly vague, referencing landmarks long since eroded or renamed. Father Thomas knew this was not enough. Ayanna explained, her voice softening at the memory of her mentor. He said we needed a map, a true map, with precise measurements that your government could not dispute. But the fever took him before we could begin. She looked at Gideon, the firelight reflecting in her dark eyes. He said the railroad would be the end of our world if we did not have the proper papers. Gideon understood the monumental task she was proposing. It would take months to conduct a thorough survey, all while evading both Captain Reynolds' obsessive hunt and the railroad's inevitable search for their missing surveyor. He was now a fugitive, allied with a woman the authorities considered a murderer. The men who attacked the survey party, Gideon said, a thought taking shape. And the robbery and redemption. I believe it was the same gang. Ayanna nodded. The one called Cain. We have seen his men before. They are not simple bandits. They move with a purpose. They seek something in this territory. He seeks me. Gideon said the words tasting like ash. Or rather, something he believes I have. He explained about the bank robbery, the murder of Elias Thorne, and the theft of the silver compass. As he spoke, a deeper, more chilling realization began to dawn. He sketched the compass from memory on a spare piece of parchment, paying close attention to the intricate miner's knot engraved on the casing. He then told her the story his father had shared only once, a tale of corruption and death in the Pennsylvania coal fields. His father, a respected crew chief, had been gathering evidence against a mine foreman, a man named Alistair Kane, whose negligence and cost-cutting measures had led to a catastrophic collapse, killing a dozen men. His father had collected signed affidavits, damning proof of Kane's guilt. But he died before he could present them to the authorities. Alistair Kane, ruined by suspicion, even without a conviction, disappeared with his family. My father once told me Gideon set his voice low that this compass held more than just a needle. He designed it with a hidden compartment sealed by a mechanism within the miner's knot. A place to keep something precious and secret. Ayanna's eyes widened as she connected the pieces. The evidence she breathed. The proof against this Alistair Kane. It has to be Gideon, affirmed the cold fury from redemption returning. His son Silas Kane believes my father ruined his family. He's been hunting for that evidence all these years to destroy it, to erase the stain on his name. He must have tracked me, learned I had the compass. The bank robbery, the attack on the survey party. It was all a cover to find me. The conflict had shifted again. It was no longer a simple fight for land or a personal quest for a stolen heirloom. It was a battle over history itself, over a truth buried for 2 decades. Silas Kane didn't just want land or wealth. He wanted to rewrite the past, to silence the confession hidden within the silver compass. Gideon's mission to help Ayanna was now inextricably bound to the quest for his father's justice. Then we have 2 wars to fight. Ayanna stated her resolve hardening. One for the soul of the land, and one for the memory of your father. They are the same war Gideon Nash, a fight against men who believe the world belongs only to them. Over the next few weeks, they began their work in earnest, a strange and singular partnership, forged in the crucible of the wilderness. Gideon with his precise instruments and methodical mind. Ayanna with her encyclopedic knowledge of the land passed down through generations. He taught her the principles of triangulation and celestial navigation. She taught him how to read the subtle language of the earth, a broken twig, a disturbed stone, the flight of a hawk, all of which told a story. Their journey took them to sacred places, a sun-drenched canyon, where the rock walls sang in the wind, a hidden spring. Where the water was said to have healing powers, a flat-topped mesa, where Apache shamans had gone for centuries to seek visions. At each location, Gideon would set up his transit, take his meticulous measurements, and make his careful notations, while Ayanna stood guard, a silent, watchful sentinel. In the quiet hours around the campfire, their professional collaboration deepened into a tentative friendship. He spoke of his mother's love for books and his father's quiet strength. She spoke of Father Thomas's wisdom and the stories of her people, tales of Coyote, the trickster, and the mountain spirits who guarded the land. One evening, while camped near a stream whose banks were littered with smooth gray stones, Ayanna spoke of Captain Reynolds. His obsession is not just for his brother. She set her gaze distant. There was an Apache woman, Mourning Dove. She was one of the 3 his brother assaulted. Reynolds. He visited our village before under a flag of truce. He spoke with her. I saw in his eyes, he cared for her in his own misguided way. And she was one of the women who died, Gideon asked gently. Ayanna shook her head. No. She survived the attack. But when Reynolds refused to bring his brother to justice, when he called her a liar to protect his family's name, her spirit broke. She walked into the desert and never returned. Reynolds believes I am to blame for that as well. For taking from him not just his brother, but the woman he secretly loved. His hunt for me is fueled by a grief he cannot admit and a guilt he cannot face. The revelation cast Captain Reynolds in a new, more tragic light. He was not a simple villain, but a man twisted by loss and a warped code of honor. He, Kane, and Gideon were all now captives of the past, their paths converging toward a violent resolution. Their work was interrupted by the appearance of a lone Apache scout, his face grim. He brought news Silas Kane had allied himself with a renegade tracker known as Crow Dog, an Apache who had sold his loyalty for white man's gold. They were scouring the territory, their numbers growing as the bounty on Ayanna and now Gideon attracted every cutthroat and opportunist in the region. Worse, Captain Reynolds and his cavalry were closing in from the south, squeezing them in a pincer movement. All paths lead to one place. Ayanna said, studying Gideon's partially completed map. A place of sanctuary. Father Thomas's old mission. It sits in a valley that can be defended with fresh water and some shelter. It is where we must make our stand and finish the map. As they packed their meager supplies and prepared to move, Gideon felt a profound shift within himself. The cautious surveyor was gone, replaced by a man who had faced death, who had lied to soldiers, and who was now an active conspirator in a rebellion against the forces of greed and power that sought to dominate this land. He looked at Ayanna, her face resolute in the firelight, and knew that he would follow her into any battle, not just for his father's memory, but for the future she was fighting to create. The final lines of their map and of their intertwined destinies would be drawn at the abandoned mission. The mission of San Esteban del Valle was a skeleton bleaching in the sun. Its adobe walls, the color of dried blood, were crumbling, and the bell tower stood like a broken tooth against the sky. It was a place of ghosts, of a faith that had failed to take root in this unforgiving soil. Yet as Gideon and Ayanna entered the silent courtyard, it felt less like a ruin and more like a fortress, a final redoubt in their war against the converging forces of Kane and Reynolds. They had 2 days. The scouts' report had been clear. Kane's gang was sweeping down from the north, while Reynolds' cavalry ascended from the south. The mission was the geographic choke point where their pursuers would inevitably meet. "We will finish the work here," Ayanna declared, her voice echoing in the chapel's hollow nave. Gideon established a workspace on the stone altar, spreading out the maps that had become the scripture of their cause. The lines and numbers represented more than geography. They were an argument, a legal and moral claim to the land that had sustained Ayanna's people for 1,000 years. He worked with a feverish intensity, his hands steady despite the exhaustion that gnawed at him. Ayanna stood watch, her eyes scanning the valley, her senses attuned to the slightest shift in the wind. On the second day, the sky began to change. The brilliant, depthless blue of the Arizona sky grew hazy, then turned a sickly yellow-brown. A low moan began to build in the distant mountains, a sound that was not the wind, but the wind's angrier, more violent cousin. "A dust storm is coming," Ayanna said, her voice grim. "A great one." The storm would be their ally and their enemy. It would provide cover, obscuring them from their pursuers, but it would also turn the valley into a maelstrom of blinding, choking dust, a chaotic battlefield with no clear lines of sight. Just as the first tendrils of wind began to whip through the courtyard, they appeared. On the northern ridge, a line of riders, Silas Kane Crow Dog, and their gang of 30 men. Almost simultaneously from the south, the blue-uniformed column of Captain Reynolds' cavalry emerged. The two forces paused, observing each other across the valley, with the mission caught squarely in the middle. The standoff, Gideon murmured, the old wooden table, feeling like the last solid thing in a dissolving world. They were trapped. Silas Kane rode forward alone, a white flag fluttering from a stick. He stopped 100 yards from the mission. Gideon Nash, his articulate voice cut through the rising wind. "I know you are in there. I have come for what is mine. Send out the compass, and I will grant you and the woman a swift death. Refuse, and your end will be a lesson in protracted suffering." Before Gideon could respond, Captain Reynolds also advanced. "Kane," he bellowed, "you and your men are under arrest for robbery and murder Ayanna. The Apache renegade is a fugitive of the United States Army. Surrender her, and I may show you leniency. The valley had become a stage for a three-act tragedy, and the storm was the rising curtain. The wind shrieked, tearing at the mission's crumbling walls, and the air grew thick with a blinding curtain of red dust. There is no escape. Ayanna said, her hand resting on the hilt of her knife. We fight here. We die here. No, Gideon said, his mind racing, his surveyor's eye, seeing not just walls and angles, but stress points and structural weaknesses. He looked up at the broken bell tower, at the massive, ancient bell still hanging precariously from its rotten beam. We don't have to beat them. We just have to survive them. He grabbed his satchel and a length of rope. I have an idea. A surveyor's solution. He explained his desperate plan. He would climb the unstable bell tower rig, the rope to the bell's main support beam, and at the right moment create a controlled collapse, bringing the tower down to block the mission's main gate, trapping Kane's men in the courtyard while creating a barrier against Reynolds' cavalry. It is a fool's plan, Ayanna said, but there was a glint of admiration in her eyes. You will be exposed. They will shoot you down. They'll be shooting into a hurricane. Gideon countered, pulling his bandana over his face as the dust storm hit with full fury. And they'll be shooting at each other first. As if on cue, the fragile truce outside shattered. A shot rang out. It was impossible to tell from which side, and the valley erupted into a chaotic three-way firefight. Men fired blindly into the swirling maelstrom their targets imagined or fleetingly glimpsed. Under the cover of the chaos, Gideon and Ayanna made their move. She would hold the chapel, their last defensible position, while he climbed the tower. He scrambled up the crumbling adobe, the wind threatening to tear him from his handholds. Dust filled his lungs, his eyes, his very being. He reached the belfry, a vortex of shrieking wind and sand. Below the courtyard was a vision of hell, shadowy figures firing at each other through the red gloom. He found the main support beam cracked and dangerously weathered. He secured the rope, his fingers numb, his mind a crystalline point of focus. A figure emerged from the dust below him, Silas Kane, moving with unerring purpose toward the chapel. He had seen through the chaos, his single-minded obsession guiding him toward his prize. Gideon knew it was now or never. He looped the rope around a smaller, sturdier beam, giving himself leverage, and pulled with all his might. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of ancient timbers, the main beam splintered. The massive bronze bell tilted, hung for a heart-stopping second, and then plunged downward. The tower did not just fall, it imploded. A cascade of adobe bricks and heavy timbers crashed into the courtyard, raising a fresh cloud of choking debris. The collapse effectively sealed the main entrance, creating a barricade of rubble that separated the cavalry from Kane's men, who were now trapped inside the mission walls. Gideon rode the wave of the collapse, half climbing, half falling down the less damaged rear wall of the tower, landing hard in the relative quiet of the chapel. Ayanna was there, her knife in hand, standing over the stunned form of one of Kane's men. But Kane himself was also there, having dived through the chapel door just as the tower fell. The dust swirled around them, the three figures locked in a tableau. Clever, Mr. Nash, Kane said, brushing dust from his duster. His cold gray eyes were fixed on Gideon. A surveyor's solution indeed. But you have only succeeded in trapping yourself with the wolf. Now give me my property. He lunged, not at Gideon, but at Ayanna. He was a brutally effective fighter, his movements a blur of calculated violence. But Ayanna was his match, her strength and ferocity a force of nature. Their fight was primal, a clash of wills in the heart of the storm. Gideon saw his chance. While Kane was occupied, he ran to the altar where his satchel lay. He pulled out the survey maps and tucked them securely inside his shirt. Then he took out the small silver compass he had carried as a decoy. "Kane," he shouted, "it's over. This is what you want." He held up the decoy compass. Kane disengaged from Ayanna, a cut on his cheek bleeding freely. He saw the compass, and a triumphant, hungry light entered his eyes. "My father's redemption," he whispered. He started toward Gideon, his revolver now in his hand. From the chaos outside, a new figure stumbled through a side entrance. Captain Reynolds, his uniform torn, his face a mask of grim determination. He saw Kane, saw Ayanna, and raised his own pistol. "It ends now," Reynolds rasped. At that moment, Gideon's choice became absolute. He could let Reynolds kill Kane, an act of justice, however tainted. Or he could offer Kane the decoy, let him escape and live to fight another day, preserving his own life and Ayanna's. But there was a third path. The surveyor's path. The path of truth. He dropped the decoy compass and pulled the real one, his father's compass, from a hidden pocket. With a twist of the miner's knot, a movement his father had shown him long ago, a tiny seam appeared. He opened the hidden compartment. A small, yellowed, folded piece of paper fell onto the stone altar. "This is what you really want, isn't it?" Silas Gideon said, his voice ringing with newfound authority. Not the compass. The confession inside it. The affidavit from another miner, a witness your father bribed, who finally told the truth before he died. The truth that your father deliberately caused that mine collapse. Kane froze, his face contorting in a mask of fury and disbelief. "Lies. Is it?" Gideon challenged. "My father died trying to bring you to justice. Elias Thorne died because you were still running from it. Your entire life has been built on a lie, and you have destroyed everything you've touched to protect it." The truth hung in the dusty air, stark and undeniable. Reynolds, listening, lowered his pistol, his face a canvas of dawning comprehension. He saw Kane not as a simple outlaw, but as a man whose evil was rooted in a deep, generational corruption. He saw the obsession that drove him and recognized a twisted reflection of his own. With a roar of pure rage, Kane lunged for the confession. Ayanna moved to intercept him, but Reynolds stepped between them. "No," the captain said, his voice quiet but firm. "This one is mine to deal with." More cavalry troopers were now pouring into the chapel through the side door. Kane was cornered, his legacy in ruins, the truth exposed. In a final desperate act, he raised his pistol to fire at Gideon. Captain Reynolds moved not to shoot, but to shield. He threw himself in front of Gideon, taking the bullet meant for him squarely in the chest. As he fell, his own gun discharged the bullet, striking Kane in the leg, sending him to the ground, howling in pain. The troopers swarmed in subduing Kane and his remaining men. Ayanna rushed to Reynolds' side. Gideon knelt beside her. The captain looked up at them, a strange peace settling on his features. He was the monster. Reynolds whispered, his eyes on Ayanna. "Not you. I was blinded by grief." His gaze found Gideon. "Use those maps, Mr. Nash. Draw a better world than the one we made." His last breath was a ragged sigh, a final release of the hatred that had consumed him. He had found his redemption not in vengeance, but in sacrifice. The dust storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air sharp and smelling of rain-soaked creosote. In the aftermath, Gideon Nash and Ayanna stood before a man who represented the future, Mr. Alistair Finch, the pragmatic, iron-willed director of the Western Pacific Railroad. They met, not in an office, but on a windswept mesa overlooking the vast territory. The mission, a broken toy in the valley below. Finch, a man for whom time was money and sentiment, a liability, listened with impatient skepticism. Gideon presented his case not with passion, but with logic, the only language Finch understood. First, he unrolled the map of the alternate route. 23 additional miles of track, Mr. Finch, Gideon explained. But you will avoid the need for 6 major trestles across unstable arroyos and 2 miles of blasting through solid granite. Your construction costs will be reduced by 30%, and your timeline shortened by 6 months. Finch's shrewd eyes traced the proposed route, his mind a swift abacus of profit and loss. Furthermore, Gideon continued placing the signed confession and documents, detailing Silas Kane's fraudulent land claims on the table. The primary route would have taken you directly into a legal and military conflict. Kane was manipulating claims to sell the railroad land that would have immediately become a war zone. This route, he tapped the new map, is clear. It bypasses the legally defined Apache territory. He slid the final completed map across the table, the map he and Ayanna had risked everything to create. It was a masterpiece of surveying a document of irrefutable precision, defining the Apache boundaries according to treaty and tradition. Finch studied the maps, then looked from Gideon's determined face to Ayanna's proud, unyielding posture. He was a builder, not a politician. War was bad for business. An elegant, cheaper solution was good for it. "The company thanks you for your creative problem-solving," Mr. Nash Finch said finally, a ghost of a smile on his thin lips. "We will proceed with the alternate route." It was a quiet victory, but a profound one. The Iron Snake would not devour Ayanna's home. Later, as the railroad men departed, Gideon and Ayanna stood alone on the mesa, the setting sun igniting the clouds in a blaze of orange and gold. Gideon held his father's silver compass. It felt different now, not a vessel of vengeance, but a tool of justice fulfilled. He opened the now empty secret compartment, then closed it again. He held it out to Ayanna. "I believe this belongs with you now," he said. "A new compass for a new path." She accepted it, her long fingers closing around the cool silver. "And what of your path, Gideon Nash? Will you return to the world of straight lines and easy answers?" Gideon looked out at the magnificent, sprawling landscape, a land he had come to measure, but which had in turn measured him. He thought of the quiet satisfaction of his work, but also of the fierce, vibrant purpose he had found beside this incredible woman. "No," he said, his voice filled with a certainty he had never known. "I'm staying. There's still work to be done, a new boundary to be drawn. Your people will need a surveyor to ensure the lines are honored." A slow, brilliant smile spread across Ayanna's face, a sunrise after a long storm. "Small Mountain," she said, using the name Grey Wolf had given him. "You have found your true place." She opened the compass. The needle quivered, then settled, pointing steadfastly north. Together, they walked to the edge of the mesa, to an old flat stone that marked the beginning of the land the map had saved. Ayanna knelt and placed the compass on the stone. Gideon looked through his transit, aligning the crosshairs with the compass needle, preparing to take the first official survey measurement of a border born not of conquest, but of justice and mutual respect. It was an act of creation, a line that did not divide but define, a promise of a new beginning etched upon the ancient land.